Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a massive, honestly super relevant theme, corporate governance and the incredible complexity of ethical decision-making. We're going to look closely at what our sources say about the specific ethical approaches that shape exactly how modern organizations operate. It's this fascinating, tangled web of strategy, morality, and law. By the end of our time today, you'll have a much clearer picture of how these invisible forces dictate the business world around us.
So let's just jump right in with the central paradox here. Why do supposedly good companies do bad things? Time and time again, we see well-resourced, highly respected organizations make just absolute catastrophic ethical missteps. Is it literally just a few bad apples? Or is there something fundamentally broken in the system itself? That question right there is exactly why we need to understand the structural rules guiding corporate behavior.
To get there, here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll hit the pillars of governance. Second, the origins of ethics. Third, core ethical frameworks. Fourth, navigating ethical dilemmas. And finally, number 5, the cost of compromise. All right, Section 1, the pillars of governance. Think of this as the rules of the game. At its core, corporate governance is the system of laws, customs, and procedures used to lead and administer a firm. It's really all about striking a very delicate balance between the needs of a company's various stakeholders. We're talking shareholders, employees, suppliers, and the broader community. And the key player calling the shots here? The board of directors. Their role goes way beyond just padding the bottom line. They literally have to steer the company through some incredibly complex social, environmental, and ethical waters. And fundamentally, good corporate governance is built on 3 massive pillars: transparency of operations, accountability towards shareholders, and absolute fairness in dealings. It's a lot like a 3-legged stool. If any of these pillars crack, if operations suddenly become secretive or leadership stops taking accountability, the entire structure of the organization is at risk of total collapse.
But of course, governance doesn't just exist in a vacuum. The external environment totally dictates the system. In developed nations, we usually see a rule-based approach. That means predictable laws, public information, and high transparency. But in a lot of developing nations, we see relationship-based governance. In these environments, public info might be kind of spotty, so business really relies on personal networks. It's more about who you know rather than what you know. Now that's not inherently evil, but it definitely lacks transparency, which can pretty easily open the back door to corruption.
Moving on to Section 2, the origins of ethics, where we look at these global philosophies.
When a company starts operating globally, they inevitably crash into this massive philosophical debate. On one side, you've got ethical universalism. This argues that fundamental notions of right and wrong apply everywhere, totally regardless of culture. On the flip side is ethical relativism, which claims that values depend entirely on local norms and customs. So think about it. What actually happens when a multinational corporation operates in a country where paying bribes or using underage labor is just the local norm? Do they adapt to the local custom to survive, or do they hold the line on a universal standard? Well, a crucial concept our sources bring up here is the integrated social contracts theory, which basically acts as a bridge. It combines both views. It says, yes, local customs absolutely matter, those are your second-order norms, but universally applicable first-order norms must always take priority, period. So in instances involving fundamentally universal norms, like, say, the prohibition of paying bribes, there is absolutely zero room for compromise. It doesn't matter what the local culture dictates, you just don't cross that line.
Which brings us to Section 3, core ethical frameworks and how we actually evaluate these tough choices. When a leader is staring down a really tough call, they usually lean on one of these core approaches. First up, the utilitarian approach. This is a consequentialist theory, meaning it looks at the outcome, aiming for the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Then there's individualism, which focuses on long-term personal interests that theoretically serve the greater good over time. Then we get into the non-consequentialist theories. We've got the moral rights approach, which fiercely protects fundamental liberties no matter what the outcome is. And finally, the justice approach, which heavily emphasizes fairness, beneficence, and inspiring trust. Taken together, these give leaders a really powerful toolkit to evaluate corporate choices way beyond just looking at the profit margins.
A super vital element of that moral rights approach is philosopher Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative. It states that you must never treat another human being simply as a means to an end, but always as an end in themselves. Think about how this directly applies to corporate responsibility. Take the pharmaceutical company Pfizer, for example. They put a massive emphasis on providing healthcare access to mothers and children in need. They aren't just treating those patients as a means to generate profit, they are treating their health and well-being as an ethical end in itself.
But let's be real, business is rarely as simple as good versus evil. The author Joseph Bararico actually calls these dirty hands problems. These are those agonizing right versus right dilemmas. Imagine you're the one who has to choose between keeping an inefficient, money-losing plant open for the good of a struggling local community versus closing it down to lower costs and protect the shareholders. Both of those choices have moral validity, right? That is what we call a defining moment.
Okay, Section 4, Navigating Ethical Dilemmas. Let's look at the practical applications.
Actually finding that optimal choice requires a really delicate balancing act. You have to take your decision makers, all the raw facts and context of the specific situation, and the various stakeholders involved, and pour them all into a pool of alternate actions. You then have to evaluate the impacts of each potential action, negotiate the painful trade-offs, and finally, filter it all down to that single optimal choice. It is a lot to juggle.
To actually make that model work in the real world, managers use this four-step framework. Identify, consider, act, and reflect. First, you explicitly identify exactly what moral standards are at risk. Second, you consider who is going to be impacted and where the conflicts of interest actually lie. Third, you make the tough call and act. And fourth, and honestly, this is often the most forgotten step, you reflect on the outcomes so you can calibrate your ethical compass for the future.
And as you're evaluating those potential actions, every single choice needs to be strictly measured against three distinct categories. First, policies. Does this action actually adhere to the company's internal procedures? Second, legal. Does it fully comply with government laws and regulations? And third, self. Does this sit right with your own personal moral compass? If an action fails even one of these tests, you are looking at a major ethical red flag.
Now for our final segment, Section 5, the cost of compromise. This is what happens when governance fails.
The Volkswagen Dieselgate scandal back in 2015 is a seriously chilling cautionary tale of structural governance failure. VW systematically manipulated their emissions test results. But how on earth did a massive scheme like that go completely undetected for years? Well, our sources point out it really came down to a flaw in their two-tier board structure. The supervisory board just totally lacked the independence and the power to properly oversee management. And because of this massive failure of accountability and transparency, their stock lost over half its worth, and the reputational damage was just staggering. Global sales dropped 4.5% in just the first full month.
But let's contrast that nightmare with a real governance success story. Right at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, Walmart made a very proactive, values-driven choice. They prioritized CDC health guidelines, heavily protected their associates and customers, and completely focused on strengthening their supply chain. Because they built real trust through responsible governance during a crisis, their business actually thrived. To put it in perspective, their grocery app saw a staggering 460% growth in daily downloads by April of 2020. It just goes to show, good ethics can absolutely drive phenomenal business outcomes.
Which brings us to the end of this explainer today. We've walked through the pillars of governance, the roots of our ethical beliefs, the specific frameworks we use to actually make decisions, and the very real-world cost of getting it wrong. I want to leave you with a provocative question to take back to your own life and career. How does your organization balance the relentless drive for profit with the uncompromising principles of integrity? Take a really hard look at your own corporate environment using the tools we unpacked today. Thanks so much for joining us. Keep asking those hard questions, and we'll see you next time.